scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Peppa's house, or so it seemed. The sun was shining through the green walls of the living room, casting familiar shadows across the purple furniture. Peppa woke up in her bed, but something felt different today. The air was thicker, heavier. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast in the kitchen, her orange dress bright against the yellow walls. But when Peppa looked closer, she noticed that Mummy Pig's smile seemed too wide, stretching further across her face than it should. Her eyelashes appeared to twitch and move on their own, like tiny black spiders. Daddy Pig sat at the breakfast table, his glasses reflecting the morning light strangely. Behind the lenses, his eyes seemed darker than normal, almost hollow. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange echo. George sat perfectly still, staring at nothing with an expression that was far too serious. The family ate their breakfast in silence, but the food tasted wrong to Peppa. Everything was too sweet, too artificial, like it was made of plastic. When she looked down at her plate, the food seemed to move slightly, shifting when she wasn't looking directly at it. After breakfast, Peppa went outside to play, but the garden looked different somehow. The grass felt spongy under her feet, like walking on something alive. The flowers in the garden had faces in their centers, tiny eyes that followed her movements. Peppa's friends arrived for their playdate, but they too seemed changed. Susie Sheep's wool was darker than usual, almost gray, and her smile revealed teeth that were far too sharp. Rebecca Rabbit's ears drooped unnaturally, and when she hopped, she made no sound at all. The children decided to play their favorite game of jumping in muddy puddles, but when they reached the puddles, the water was black as ink. When Peppa jumped in, the splash made no sound, and the liquid clung to her feet like thick syrup. The reflection showed not Peppa's face, but something else entirely. As the day progressed, the changes became more obvious. The sun began to flicker like a broken light bulb, casting strange shadows that moved independently. The trees swayed without any wind, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Inside the house, the television began to turn on by itself, showing static that occasionally formed shapes like faces. The pictures on the walls started to change, the happy family photos becoming distorted. The clock ticked backwards, and time itself seemed to be unraveling. Peppa tried to tell her family about the strange things she was seeing, but when she spoke, her voice sounded different, deeper and more hollow. Her family listened with those too wide smiles, nodding in unison like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The house itself began to change around them. The walls started to breathe, expanding and contracting slowly like the inside of some enormous creature. The floorboards creaked with each breath, and the windows began to fog up from the inside. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but the dining room had transformed. The tables stretched impossibly long, and there were too many chairs, filled with shadowy figures that Peppa couldn't quite see clearly. Peppa realized that she was trapped in a world that looked like her home, but was something else entirely. Everything familiar had become a twisted version of itself.
Peppa Pig, the guest with no mouth. It was a normal evening. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, Mummy Pig was knitting, and George was playing with his dinosaur. But when Peppa walked into the living room, he was already there. Sitting on the sofa, between Daddy and the armchair, was a guest, a stranger, very tall, with a smooth, bald head and very large, round eyes. He didn't speak, didn't move, he just stared. "Who's that?" Peppa whispered. "Oh, Peppa," Mummy smiled. "That's our guest. He's been here since morning." "I don't remember him." "You probably just didn't notice," Daddy Pig replied. "He's very quiet." The guest didn't say a word. He just watched. His eyes were open far too wide, as if he couldn't blink. His face, smooth, with no mouth, no wrinkles, only emptiness and silence. Peppa sat next to George, but she couldn't stop watching the guest. Something was wrong. He didn't breathe. He didn't twitch. But every time she looked away, he seemed a little closer. At first, he was sitting in the corner, then in the nearby chair, then at the edge of the sofa. "George, do you see that?" she whispered. He was farther away, George said. Is he moving? But as soon as they looked directly at him, he froze again, as if he'd always been sitting right there. He never blinks, Peppa added. Never. Before bed, she asked Mummy, Will he still be here tonight? Of course, Mummy said calmly. He's our guest. Peppa got into bed, trying not to think about him. But when the house fell quiet, she heard a soft creak and footsteps. She sat up. The door to their room was open. A faint light from the hallway spilled in, and in it, his silhouette. Tall, still. He was standing in the doorway, watching. Peppa held her breath. He didn't move, but when she blinked, he was closer and closer. George, wake up. But George was asleep. When Peppa looked at the door again, he was gone. She slowly turned her head. He was standing by the bed, but now his face had changed. Where there was once nothing, now there was a slit, slowly opening, and inside, no teeth, just darkness, endless, pulling darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the darkness inside him seemed to shift on its own. Peppa shut her eyes tight, pressed herself close to George, and then everything went silent. In the morning, the guest was gone. Mummy and Daddy said nothing, only smiled. Did you sleep well, Peppa? Daddy Pig asked. She nodded without looking at the sofa, because she knew he was still there, just sitting and waiting for someone to look away.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy Friday afternoon when Peppa and George arrived at Grandpa Pig's house. The old house looked familiar, but today something felt different. The rain against the windows sounded like whispers, and the usual warmth seemed replaced by an inexplicable chill. Grandpa Pig greeted them with his usual smile, but his eyes seemed to follow them everywhere, even when looking elsewhere. His voice carried an odd echo that bounced off walls that weren't there. In the living room, Grandpa Pig had prepared his vegetable garden puzzle. But as they pieced it together, the vegetables seemed to change when no one was looking. Carrots became twisted, potatoes sprouted blinking eyes, and tomatoes pulsed like tiny hearts. Grandpa Pig suggested visiting his greenhouse. The plants seemed to lean toward them as they walked past, leaves rustling without wind. Flowers turned to follow their movement, and vines reached out with finger-like tendrils. In the center stood a new plant Peppa had never seen. It was tall and dark, with leaves that absorbed light. Grandpa Pig explained it bloomed once every 100 years, and today might be the day. The plant began opening its bud, revealing not a flower, but a tiny door. George pointed excitedly, but Peppa saw tiny footprints in the soil around the plant's base. The footprints were too small for any known animal, leading in circles as if something had been dancing in the darkness. The rain grew heavier, drumming with increasing intensity, but the sound had a rhythm, like a coded message tapped by invisible fingers. When they turned to leave, the greenhouse door appeared much farther away than when they entered. Walking back, Peppa noticed their reflections in the windows moved differently. George's reflection waved while he stood still, and her own reflection seemed to mouth unspoken warnings through the fogged glass. Inside, the teacups rattled without being touched. The grandfather clock chimed 13 times when it should have been 3. Family photographs showed different people than that morning, though the faces seemed almost familiar. Upstairs, the stairs creaked after Peppa stopped moving, as if invisible footsteps followed. The hallway stretched longer than remembered, with doors that hadn't been there before. One door revealed a room of old toys that moved when she wasn't looking. A rocking horse rocked gently, a music box played an unrecognizable melody, and dolls turned their heads to watch her pass. At the hallway's end, a window showed a garden she'd never seen. Instead of vegetable patches, there was a hedge maze. In the center stood a figure like George, but the real George answered from downstairs. Grandpa Pig told George stories that kept changing. First, the house was 50 years old, then 100, then he claimed it had always existed. His voice grew softer and more distant with each word. When Mummy Pig arrived, Peppa had left her teddy bear somewhere. She found it in the greenhouse, next to the mysterious plant. The bear was completely dry despite the afternoon rain. Driving away, Peppa looked back through the car window. For a moment, she saw figures in the upstairs windows, more than there should have been, waving with too many arms. When she blinked, the windows were empty, but curtains still swayed as if someone had just stepped away.
A lost Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV. Night fell upon Peppa Pig's house, bringing with it an unaccustomed silence. Even the crickets outside were quiet. Peppa lay on her top bunk trying to fall asleep, but something unsettled her. George, below, snored peacefully, but Peppa felt she wasn't alone in the stillness. Suddenly, from the depths of the house, a faint, drawn-out creak echoed. It sounded like an old, ungreased door, but it seemed to emanate from the very walls. The creak repeated, a little louder this time, and Peppa felt a shiver run down her spine. She cautiously peeked out from under her covers. The room was shrouded in gloom, and the shadows cast by the furniture seemed alive. The creak became rhythmic, as if someone was slowly and heavily walking across the wooden floor. The footsteps drew closer, and Peppa realized they were coming from the hallway directly towards their room. She held her breath, listening to every sound. The door to their room was slightly ajar, and a faint light from the hallway seeped through the crack. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then another creak sounded, but this time it was very close, as if someone was slowly opening the door. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, afraid of what might enter. She heard a soft rustle, like the whisper of old fabric, and felt the air in the room grow heavy and cold. Opening her eyes, she saw a thin, writhing shadow slowly creeping into the room through the crack in the door. The shadow resembled a long, twisting ribbon, slowly slithering across the floor, approaching George's bed. The shadow reached George's bed and began to slowly ascend it. Peppa couldn't move, her body seemingly paralyzed by fear. She watched as the shadow enveloped the sleeping George, and from within it came a faint, barely discernible whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves. The whisper grew louder, and Peppa felt her eyelids grow heavy. The last thing she saw were two dull, glowing points in the center of the shadow, staring directly at her. Then darkness consumed her. In the morning, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered the room. Peppa was asleep in her bunk, but George was not in his bed below. His blanket was neatly folded, and his favorite dinosaur toy lay on his pillow. The parents searched the entire house, but George was nowhere to be found. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, if you listen closely, you might hear a faint, drawn-out creak echoing from the depths of the house, and a soft, barely discernible whisper that seems to call out a name.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The day started like any other in the Pig family household. But something felt different from the moment Peppa woke up. The sunlight streaming through her bedroom window seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows that moved independently of the clouds outside. When she looked at her alarm clock, the hands were spinning backwards, yet somehow she knew exactly what time it was. George was already awake in his room, but he wasn't playing with his usual dinosaur toys. Instead, he was having a conversation with someone Peppa couldn't see. She could hear his little voice through the wall, asking questions and pausing as if listening to responses. When she pressed her ear against the wall, she could almost make out another voice answering him, but it sounded like it was coming from very far away. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast, but the kitchen looked different. The familiar yellow walls seemed to shift between colors when no one was looking directly at them. The refrigerator hummed a melody that sounded almost like a lullaby, but the tune was slightly off, making it feel unsettling rather than comforting. When Mummy Pig opened the refrigerator door, cold mist poured out like fog, and for just a moment, she thought she saw tiny figures moving inside among the food. Daddy Pig was in the garden, but he wasn't doing his usual gardening. He was standing perfectly still, staring at a spot in the ground where nothing seemed to be growing. When Peppa called to him from the window, he turned around slowly, and his smile seemed wider than it should be. He waved at her with movements that were just a little too mechanical, like a wind-up toy running down. At breakfast, the family sat around the table, but their reflections in the window behind them didn't quite match their movements. When Peppa reached for her juice, her reflection reached for something else entirely. George's reflection seemed to be eating something different from what was on his plate, and their parents' reflections appeared to be having a completely different conversation than the one happening at the table. The telephone rang during breakfast, but when Daddy Pig answered it, there was no one on the other end. Just silence. But if you listened very carefully, you could hear what sounded like breathing, and occasionally a whisper that might have been someone saying their names. Each time the phone rang after that, it rang exactly 13 times before stopping, even when someone tried to answer it. Peppa decided to go outside to play, but the playground looked strange. The swings were moving gently back and forth even though there was no wind, and the slide seemed longer than it used to be. When she climbed to the top, she could see much further than she ever had before, all the way to places that didn't look familiar, with houses that seemed to be built upside down and trees that grew downward into the sky. George joined her outside, but he brought his dinosaur toys, and they were behaving oddly. The plastic dinosaurs seemed to be watching everything with their painted eyes, and when George wasn't looking directly at them, they appeared to change positions slightly. The toy T-Rex's mouth seemed to open and close as if it was trying to say something important. The neighbors started coming outside too, but they all moved in perfect synchronization, like they were following the same invisible conductor. Mrs. Rabbit waved from her garden, but her wave continued for much longer than a normal wave should, and her smile never changed. Mr. Bull was mowing his lawn in perfectly straight lines, but the grass he had already cut seemed to be growing back immediately behind him. As the day progressed, the family noticed that their shadows were acting independently. Peppa's shadow would sometimes point in different directions than her finger, and George's shadow appeared to be playing with shadow toys that George wasn't actually holding. Mummy and Daddy Pig's shadows seemed to be having their own private conversation, gesturing and moving in ways that didn't match what their owners were doing. The house itself began to feel alive. Doors would creak open just a crack when no one was near them, and footsteps could be heard in empty rooms. The grandfather clock in the hallway started chiming at random intervals, sometimes playing melodies instead of simple chimes. The pictures on the walls seemed to watch the family as they moved through the house, and occasionally, someone in a photograph would appear to blink. When evening came, the family gathered to watch television, but every channel showed the same thing. Their own house, filmed from impossible angles. They could see themselves sitting in the living room, but the version on TV was slightly different. The TV family's movements were delayed by just a few seconds, and sometimes the TV family would do things that the real family hadn't done yet. As night fell, the stars outside arranged themselves into patterns that spelled out words, but the words kept changing before anyone could read them completely. The moon seemed closer than usual, and its face appeared to be watching the house with great interest. Street lights flickered in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code, sending messages to anyone who might be listening. The family went to bed, but sleep felt different. Their dreams seemed to blend together, and they found themselves sharing the same strange visions of floating through rooms that were bigger on the inside than the outside, and meeting versions of themselves that lived in a world where everything was just slightly wrong. In the morning, everything returned to normal, but each family member secretly wondered if the normal world was real, or if the strange day had been the real one, and this was just another dream that they were all sharing together.